A 35-year-old man on death row in Texas faces execution tonight for a murder he did not commit. Jeff Wood was an accomplice in a 1996 convenience store robbery. He was sitting in a truck outside when the clerk was shot and killed. The man who pulled the trigger was executed 6 years ago. But Jeff Wood was given a death sentence for the same crime under the Texas law of parties. We'll go to the prison where Jeff Wood is awaiting death. His wife, his mother, and father are outside. We'll speak with them there. All that and more coming up. I'm Amy Goodman with Juan Gonzales.
And welcome to all of our listeners and viewers around the country and around the world. A 35-year-old man on death row in Texas faces execution tonight for a murder he didn't commit. Jeff Wood is scheduled to die by lethal injection at 6 p.m. Texas time unless Governor Rick Perry grants him clemency. No one disputes the fact that Jeff Wood did not kill anyone, but he was convicted and sentenced to death under Texas's law of parties for the 1996 murder of convenience store clerk Chris Kieran. Wood was sitting in a truck outside the store when the murder occurred. The man who confessed to the killing, Daniel Renault, was executed 6 years ago. But the Texas law of parties allows accomplices to be subject to the death penalty if a murder occurs during a crime, even if he or she did not commit it. So 1 year after Renault was given a death sentence for killing Kieran, Jeff Wood was given a death sentence for the same crime, essentially for failing to anticipate that a murder would occur during the robbery. The Texas Board of Pardons and Paroles denied Wood clemency on Tuesday, the day he turned 35 on death row in Livingston, Texas. His lawyers have filed a clemency letter with Governor Rick Perry requesting a 30-day reprieve. The letter notes that Wood may be incompetent to be executed and requires mental health services. An initial jury had found Wood to be mentally incompetent to stand trial.
We're joined now by three guests, by Kristen Wood, Jeff Wood's wife, and Danny and Mitzi Wood, his mother and father. In this exclusive, they join us from Livingston, Texas. They're sitting right outside of the prison where Jeff is now waiting to die. We're also joined here in New York by Liliana Segura. She's a board member of the Campaign to End the Death Penalty and a staff writer and editor at AlterNet.org. We're going to start right here in New York. Liliana, you've been following this case extensively. Lay it out from the beginning and explain this law of parties.
Well, basically, in the early hours of January 2nd, 1996, Jeff Wood was sitting in his brother's pickup truck outside of this Texaco station in Kerrville, Texas. And he, in the preceding weeks, had discussions with Daniel Renault about possibly holding up this store, and it was supposed to be an inside job. They knew the store, they knew the people who worked there, they hung out there, and this man named Bill Bunker, the assistant manager, had said that he would help them navigate the security cameras and the safe and all of that. But when
he was in on it,
he was in on it, yeah. But when it came down to that morning, things didn't go according to plan, and the person behind the counter instead was the man who was later shot was Chris Kieran. Now, Chris was also friends with these guys, and it's disputable whether or not he also knew about it, but when it came down to it, he didn't cooperate, and Daniel Renault shot him in the face, and he died instantly. Now, at the time Jeff Wood was sitting in the car, he heard the shot, he ran in. It's unclear what happened immediately, but he clearly saw that Daniel had a gun and helped him carry out this robbery, and they came away with a few $1,000s. They were arrested soon thereafter. They confessed to the crime, and Wood helped lead police to the murder weapon. So. And as you laid it out, you know, what happened after that was that Daniel Renault went to trial, and it was undisputed. He was the killer. He admitted to it, and Wood was characterized as sort of this hapless sidekick who didn't really have that much to do with the murder itself. And then when it came down to try Wood for the crime, he actually initially was found incompetent to stand trial. He was deemed, delusional, mentally unstable. He actually spent some time in a mental institute. And then later on was deemed by another jury to actually be competent to stand trial. Fast forward a year later, in 1998, Jeff Wood was sentenced to death a year after Daniel Renault was sentenced to death for the same murder.
Now, the Supreme Court has ruled in other cases that people who are mentally retarded could not be executed, but the issue of mental illness is not as clear, is it?
It's not as clear, although there's a very current case, the case of Scott Panetti out of Texas, that says that, mental illness absolutely is grounds for an execution not to follow through. But the more relevant Supreme Court rulings in this case have to do with the law of parties, which is the law that you mentioned. This is a law that there are two decisions that the Supreme Court has made that inform this question. And the first was in 1982, the decision in Edmund versus Florida, which said that a person should not be sentenced to death if they didn't have a direct role in committing a murder. And then 5 years later, in Tyson versus Arizona, the Supreme Court ruled that if a person had a role in a crime in which they showed a reckless disregard for human life, that a death sentence was appropriate. So supporters of the law of parties and defenders of it on legal grounds look to Tyson versus Arizona, but Edmund versus Florida is really the prevailing view. It's very odd or very rare for somebody to be sentenced to death for a crime in which they weren't the trigger person.
Did Wood know that Renault had the gun?
No. Well, his lawyers have argued, that he absolutely didn't know. They even say that the day that the crime was carried out, Wood had tried to dissuade Renault from taking the gun. So apparently he was very surprised when he heard the shot, not only because he was startled, but because he didn't realize that Renault had the gun.
But it's irrelevant in the law of parties. It doesn't matter whether he knew or not.
Well, it is. It's definitely relevant because the question, it really hinges on this question of whether a murder could have been anticipated, whether this person who participated in this conspiracy to commit a felony could have anticipated that a murder would be carried out. In this case, if he thought that Daniel Renault didn't have a gun, then absolutely he couldn't have anticipated that this would have happened. But the other thing is that this was an inside job. Again, there was no reason that they would have needed to bring a gun in the first place. But
there is the issue. Proponents of his being executed would raise that he then proceeded with the robbery after the shooting of the victim, after the killing of the victim.
What about his counsel?
Well, his counsel was practically non-existent, and actually this is one of the huge problems that this has only really come out in the clemency brief that his current attorneys have filed. But his counsel basically, first of all, he tried to fire them halfway through the trial. I mean, after he was deemed mentally incompetent, he tried to fire them. They said this is quote unquote suicide, what he's doing, but they failed to bring up his abuse as a child, his potential mental incompetency, his all of these factors. But then during the sentencing phase, this man nicknamed Dr. Death, a man named Dr. James P. Grigson, who is nicknamed Dr. Death, he is a man who has been brought in by the state of Texas in numerous death penalty cases to argue that the defendant stands to threaten society, basically, that this person needs to be sentenced to death because he poses a danger to society. Now, this person in 1995 was kicked out of the American Psychiatric Association and for flagrant ethical violations, quote unquote. So, and this all happened before Wood's trial, and his attorneys failed to bring it up.
They didn't cross-examine any.
That's right. They didn't cross-examine anyone, and so I mean, he was really railroaded. Now, the other thing to note in this case that's so important and so distressing is that, exactly a year ago at this time, I was sitting in this seat talking about the case of Kenneth Foster, who is a man who at the last second was saved by a grassroots movement to stop his execution. Kenneth Foster was also sentenced under the law of parties. He was 19 years old, acting as the getaway driver in a series of robberies that at the end of the night culminated with the death of the son of a prominent attorney in San Antonio. Kenneth Foster was 80 feet away in a car with the windows rolled up, didn't realize what had happened, and nevertheless was sentenced to death for this murder that was committed by this man named Mauricio Brown. Mauricio Brown was executed in 2006, and Kenneth Foster still, in August of 2007, last year, faced execution for this crime. So it's really distressing in the sense that Texas clearly hasn't learned its lesson about the law of parties.
And
but in that case, Rick Perry the governor did stop the execution.
In that case, the Texas Board of Prisons and Pardons and Paroles voted in a vote of 6-1 to recommend clemency, and that had a lot to do with the fact that there was a huge public outcry against the law of parties. Editorials were run in prominent Texas papers. Major international figures, Desmond Tutu, came out and said this is an egregious miscarriage of justice. And despite the fact that the facts of this case are very, very similar, the board voted in a unanimous vote 7-0 on Tuesday to proceed with the execution.